What's worse than finding a worm in your apple? Finding half a worm. I'm sure everybody's familiar with this classic joke, right? Because if you find a half a worm, it means you already ate the other half, right? Okay. Well, anyways, by deductive reasoning, one could then further argue, what's worse than finding half a worm in your apple? Finding a quarter of a worm. What's worse than finding a quarter of a worm? Finding an eighth of a worm. And what's worse than finding an 18th of a worm, a 16th of a worm, and to finally, what's the worst thing you can? No worm. If you find no worm, that means you ate the whole worm. Okay, but obviously nobody actually reacts that way. Nevertheless, okay, what's my point? This week's Parsha, Parshas Tazria, we have a double Parsha actually, Tazria-Metzora, which both speak about the affliction known as tzara'as. And an interesting thing we read about in Parshas Tazria, there's a lesion, a white spot on the skin called a nega, and the kohen comes and he assesses whether or not that spot has grown, how much of the skin has it spread out on, and there's a quarantine process where the Metzora has to wait in order for to be diagnosed by the kohen. But at any rate, the signifying symptoms of the tzara'as element are these negoyim, these white aberrations on the skin, discolorations. At any rate, so we learn all about this, and then we learn a very interesting law. What happens if somebody's entire body is covered in tzara'as? His entire body is all the color of these tzara'as afflictions, meaning this white color. Very interesting law. The pasuk tells us, Kulo hafach lavan, if he entirely turns white, this shade of white, tahor hu. The ruling is he is pure. So it's very funny. You think about it. If a person has a little bit of a spot, tameh, he's impure. If he has a big spot, tameh. If he has half of his body covered in these spots, tameh. 90% of his body covered in these spots, tameh. 100%, tahor, he's pure. It's very funny. It's very interesting. Now, I want to point out that this law, hamaladically, on the level of drush, is also the source for an interesting statement that our sages make regarding the time right before Moshiach comes. And in addition to this being connected to this week's Parsha of Tazria-Metzora, I also wanted to talk about it this week because last week our class on Parshas Shmini spoke about Moshiach. We spoke about the law of a kohen not being able to drink lest Moshiach arrive and he would not be able to perform the Avodah. And some of the feedback I got from some people was a little bit, I'd say, tenuous. They were like, is it necessarily such a good thing that Mashiach could come so quickly? I mean, I hear negative things about the time right before Mashiach, that it's going to get really, really bad. So I wanted to address that attitude, the people who are hesitant or wary about Mashiach's coming. And this is a perfect opportunity to do so. There's a section in the Gemara Sanhedrin towards the end of the Masechta, which we know as the Agadata of Chelik. The whole Perek is known as Perek Chelik. It starts with the Mishnah Kol Yisrael Yishlem Chelik Leilam Haba. All the Jewish people have a portion of the world to come, and there are many Agadic passages there about Mashiach and the time right before Mashiach. So here's one of the things it tells us in the Gemara Sanhedrin, Daf Tzadig Zayin Omer Aleph. Omer Rab Yitzchok, Ein ben David ba ad shenishapech kol hamalchus leminos. Ben David, the descendant of King David, meaning Mashiach, will not come until the malchus, the government, has been completely turned over to heresy. The Gemara continues, Amar Rava, Maikra, Rava asks, what is the scriptural basis for that for this statement? Everything has to come from Torah. So where do you get it from Torah? Kulo hafach lavan, if he became completely white, tahor, he is pure. In other words, you're going to ask, what's the source for saying that right before things get really, really good, right before Moshiach comes, it's going to get really, really bad, that not only really bad, completely bad, that the entire government, or all governments, kol hamalchus, nishapech laminos, will become heretical. Where do you get this from? Where do we get it from? At least on a homiletical level, on the level of drush, we get it from this concept that if somebody becomes completely tzara'as-like, kulei lavan, completely white, like the tzara'as affliction, tahor, the ruling is that he's pure. So in other words, it gets so bad that it's good. So let's talk a little bit about this. What does it mean it gets so bad that it's good? So there are two ways of looking at this, two approaches. Both regarding the ruling about tzara'as, as well as the teaching about the time right before Mashiach. Same two approaches. Let's go through them. But let's talk about it in terms of tzara'as. One approach is that the whole thing is a gzeres hakosov. That means a scriptural decree. It's not logical. Doesn't have to make sense. This is just the rule. So you're going to say, but if the guy becomes entirely white, now all of a sudden he's fine. If he had a little white spot, that's bad. If he had a lot of white spots, that's also bad. All white spots, now it's fine. Okay, yeah, fine. Yeah, that's what it is. What? And the rest of tzara'as makes sense to you? The whole thing is a gzeres hakosov. The whole thing is a supra-rational decree. It transcends logic. Doesn't have to conform to your expectations. The whole thing is spiritual. The whole thing is beyond our mortal minds are able to understand. So there you go. So you don't be shocked. Well, it doesn't have to make sense. That's one approach. The other, and I want to understand, it's not a push-off. It's an earnest, it's a sincere answer. The whole thing of tumah v'tara, of purity and impurity, this isn't a physical condition. This is not a medical condition. It has symptoms on the body as if it were a medical condition, but the whole thing is a spiritual thing. It doesn't even exist anymore because we're not spiritually elevated enough to even experience this affliction. So it's a spiritual thing. It's an otherworldly thing. You want to make it make sense? It doesn't have to make sense according to human intellect. So it gets so bad that it becomes good. Doesn't make sense? Okay, doesn't have to make sense. All right. So that's the first approach. Second approach, an exact opposite approach. It's a milsa b'taima. It's very logical. Makes perfect sense. What's the logic? The logic is like this. Follow here. Tzara'as is an aberration, a dysfunction, an abnormality, right? It's different than the rest of the skin. And that's why it's a sign that there's something wrong with the person. And that's what makes him ritually impure. However, let's say there's a guy whose entire epidermis, all of his skin, when we were kids, we used to harass each other, say, your epidermis is showing. Anyways, imagine all of his skin, his entire epidermis, has become this color. Well, now you can't call it a dysfunction. You can't call it an aberration or a deviation. That's what his skin is. Kulei lavan, it's all this white color. Tahor. So apparently this is his norm. It's not a break from the norm. It's not abnormal. This is his normal. Okay, it's not normal compared to other people, but for him, that's his normal. So that's the second approach. That when you have the breakout of the negoyim, of these lesions, where they are a deviation, so then it's a sign of impurity. But when it becomes the entire skin is that way, so that's just what his skin is like. And therefore, it's not a sign of impurity. Okay. Those are the two approaches. Now, after we've seen how they apply to understanding this law about tzara'as, let's apply it to Moshiach. First, the the approach that it's a gzeras hakosef, that it doesn't have to conform to rationality. Here's the approach. The approach is like this. So human history sort of goes along, and different governments rule, and different forms of government, and different parties, and different systems of government, and eventually it gets really, really bad. You know, human corruption leads to just like the most severe or most absolute state that it could ever reach, and things are just totally terrible, and there's no way out. And then Hashem just swoops in, and he redeems everything. You know, in drama, in literary terms, I'm saying going back to the ancient Greeks. In fact, this is a Greek. Originally, it's a Greek term. In English, we use the Latin version of it, but the term is the Deus ex machina. Deus means God, ex means from or out of, machina means the machine. God from the machine. What is that talking about? In the old plays, in the ancient plays, sometimes the writer, you know, a play is about conflict. You have to have drama. You have to have, you know, an antagonist. You have to have a problem. So the bigger the problem, the more formidable the enemy, then the more exciting it is. But sometimes the writer is so good that he paints himself into such a corner he can't even write himself out of it because it's just too big of a problem to solve. So what they would do, literally, this is where the expression comes from. They would have the Deus ex machina, the God from the machine. They would have an actor who would be portraying one of their gods, one of their avodah zaros, would literally swoop in on a crane. He'd be hanging from a crane, and he would swoop onto the stage, and he would fix everything, and hooray, an ending, everyone's happy, okay? Like the Americans like. A nice Hollywood ending, everything ends happy, okay. And that's one approach to human history, is saying, look, it gets bad, and it gets bad, and it gets bad, and it gets so bad, there's no way to fix it. It's just completely systemically broken. And then, what do you want? You know, Hashem can do anything. Hashem swoops in, and he brings Moshiach. It's incongruous, yeah, it doesn't make sense. It's like totally out of, it's totally out of step with what's been going on. But Hashem can do it. Why not? Just like we were talking about before about the tzara'as. So the tzara'as makes sense to you? It doesn't have to make sense, just however Hashem wants to do it. The same thing here. History just gets worse and worse and worse, and people get worse, and governments become more and more corrupt, and when it gets totally corrupt, Hashem just swoops in and fixes the whole thing. Okay, fine. That's one approach to understanding it. And I could understand why, according to that approach, we were mentioning before, people were like hesitant about Mashiach coming. According to that approach, I understand that. You know, that things are going to get so bad that really there's no way that they could get better, except for the fact that, you know, Hashem can ultimately just do whatever he wants. Then there's the second approach. Second approach, we said, was the rational approach, the logical approach, that there's a certain inherent, or at least internal logic here working. What we said before, the guy becomes entirely tzara'as-like, then it's not tzara'as. That is his normal. So too, there's a logical way of looking at why all governments becoming completely heretical would be a natural precursor to the coming of Mashiach. Okay, what is that logic? Very simple. Winston Churchill said that democracy is the absolute worst form of government ever devised by man until you compare it to all the others. There's certain truth to that. What was Churchill saying? Churchill was saying all man-made forms of government are corrupt. They're all broken. They're all messed up. Democracy is the least messed up. And that's basically true. All forms of government, all those who exercise power, if it's based on human reason, human morality, human sensibilities, is going to be fundamentally flawed and lacking. And then you just pick the one that's least fundamentally flawed and lacking. You know, there's a story, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was once on a train, and a couple of intellectuals were having a discussion. Which is more similar to Torah, communism or capitalism? Okay, so that's an economic system, not a political system, but the same similar kind of idea here. And so they asked the Rebbe Rayatz to chime in to sort of settle the debate. So it's very interesting. The Rebbe Rayatz said to these intellectuals, he says, there's truth in both of them. In capitalism is the truth of Yevarecha Hashem b'chol asher taseh. Hashem will bless you in everything that you do. You have to put forth effort to be successful. But then in communism is the truth of efes kiloi yeh b'cha evyain, that there will not be any poor among you. Communism says we're not allowing anyone to be poor. And they're both truths within Torah, and each of these economic systems has one of those truths reflected in it. The thing is, though, neither of them have the whole truth. And no man-made system of economics or politics has the whole truth in it. The only system that has the entire truth is Torah. And furthermore, whatever truth that is in any of the man-made systems ultimately comes from Torah. I think it's just a remarkable story, especially if you think about the fact that the Rebbe Rayatz was persecuted by the communists and arrested by them and tortured. And if it were me, you'd ask me to chime in on a conversation about capitalism. Communism, those are the guys who what they did to me. But the objectivity, the detachment with which he was able to answer the question, it's very enlightening. Look, there's truth in all the isms, or most of the isms, or a lot of the isms. Just none of them has the whole truth. And whatever bit of truth each of them have, ultimately comes from Torah. Torah brought that idea to the world. Torah introduced it to humanity. So the point is, what am I saying? I'm saying, like Churchill said, that democracy is the worst government until you compare it to all the others. Every man-made system is broken and flawed, but has some good in it. And it's based on that little bit of good in it that people put up with it. So for a while, people, they had their kings. And then a few hundred years ago, they decided they didn't want their kings. They wanted a democracy. And then everyone became democratic. And it's like, basically, human history is the story of people saying, what's the lesser of the two evils at this point? What are we willing to put up with? And until you get to a point like we're at right now, where basically that's the way most people are feeling today in America, 2020. We're about to go into a presidential race, or we're really in the middle of a presidential race right now. We just had one 4 years ago. Most people, the polls showed, were not voting for a candidate. They were voting against the candidate that they didn't want. So really, it was a question of just lesser of two evils. Which one of these is which one of these is the least offensive option to me? And about 10 years ago, there was a poll that they asked people where they got their political news from, or what they felt was the most reliable source of political news. And a Jewish comedian, Jon Stewart, happened to have been, won the poll, or most people said he was the most reliable source of political news. And it's interesting because they asked him about it. He was interviewed, and they said, "You're a comedian, you're doing political humor. What do you think about the fact you're more trusted as a source of political news than the anchors of the network news stations?" And he says it was a protest vote. It was a none of the above vote. In other words, he wasn't even taking it so seriously as a compliment to himself. He was basically saying, look, people are fed up. They know that everybody is corrupt. Everybody's trying to sell them a load of goods. And so, basically, who do they say is the most reliable person? The comedian. Because basically, it's that's people's way of saying, we don't like any of the options that we're being presented with. And that really is sort of the day and age that we live in today, is sort of this day and age of profound disillusionment with all political parties, all governments, all forms of government, all of the media which deliver information about government, whether it's left or it's right. I mean, it's always just what's the lesser of two evils, and it's all evil, it's all corrupt, it's all manipulative, and that seems to be the prevailing attitude today. And the truth is, that's not a bad thing. In fact, that is part of a natural process that leads seamlessly to Moshiach. Yeah, sure. Because basically what's happening is that we're going through a process where we're gaining clarity. We're getting clarity. Clarity is a good thing. See, it's been taking thousands of years of human history, but until now it's sort of like, well, this government's not perfect, but it has this benefit or that benefit, and we rationalize all this flawed and imperfect and ultimately harmful stuff, because what choice do we have? What choice do we have? But as we're coming closer to the end of Golus, we're getting clarity, and we're saying, you know what? This stuff is all bad. We don't want any of it. Really, like Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government. We don't want any of these man-made governments. They're all minus. They're all heresy. You want to tell me this one's better than that? You know what? Forget about these gradations, this sophisticated way of saying, well, this is the lesser of two evils. That's the sophisticated way of rationalizing evil. Well, it's relatively not as bad when you compare. You know what? It's good or it's not good. So Baruch Hashem, we're getting to the point where we're saying all forms of government, all the ruling parties, it's all minus, it's all heresy, it's all bad. And we don't want anything else but what? The one pure, true form of government. Yeah, Mashiach. That's all we want. And in fact, this Gemara about Ein ben David ba ad shenishapach kol malchus leminus, that when right before Mashiach comes, all the governments will become heretical. So I mentioned this is from Sanhedrin, where we're learning it. A similar line, pretty much the same line, also appears at the end of the Gemara Saita, which, by the way, we're learning right now. There's a custom. There's 49 pages or folios in Saita, and there's 49 days of Sfiras HaOmer, and there's a custom to learn a page a day, daf a day. But at the very end of the tractate, it also talks about Mashiach over there. And it also has this line that right before Mashiach comes, all governments will be heretical. And I mentioned some other things that will be going on that are seemingly negative at the end of the time right before Mashiach comes. And then it concludes and says, Va'al ma yesh lonu lihisha'en. So what then can we rely upon? If everything is corrupt, what are we relying upon? Alavinu shebeshamayim. Only upon our Father in heaven. And that's the point here, that we're coming to the point of clarity. We're coming to the point where we're saying, you know what? All these governments, all these forms of rulership that we've been rationalizing and saying, it's good enough, or it could be worse, could be worse, could be. We don't want it anymore. We only want the one true, pure, holy, God-given form of government. We want Mashiach as a king, with the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, with the Beis HaMikdash. That's the only thing we want. And we want to stop tolerating all of these defective forms of man-made government. After the forming of the state of Israel, so there was a rabbinical proclamation that came out that said it's a mitzvah to vote. They were encouraging the religious to vote in Israel. So certain rabbis came out, said it's a mitzvah to vote in Israel. So somebody came to the Belzer Rebbe and Reb Aaron, and they asked him, Taka, it's a mitzvah to vote? And he says, yeah. And they said, a mitzvah, like eating matzah? He said, maybe more like eating moror. What did he mean? He meant, we don't relish this. This is not, nobody's enjoying this. But in this situation, what choice do we have? It's like eating moror. It's bitter. It's bitter. But we have to be politically involved, so that's the way that the Belzerov sought to be politically involved, and that's what he told his class. The only point I'm making here is, it's a necessary evil of the exile, of being in Golus, that we have to eat that morah, and that we have to decide which one of these corrupt forms of man-made governments is going to be worse, and then go pick the other one. We don't want that anymore. We want to be able to say, you know what? Get rid of it all. None of the above. We only want Moshiach. So, therefore, let's talk about how all of governments becoming heretical right before Mashiach coming is a natural precursor and lead in to Mashiach's coming. It's very simple. The narrative is very, very, it's natural, it's organic, seamless. That as we, through process of elimination, all of history has been a big laboratory. The planet Earth has been this laboratory where we've experimented with every form of government and rule that every genius has ever come up with. We've tried them all out, and you know what? They're all minus, they're all heresy. We only want, and we've come to the point where we're ready to say, we want nothing less than Mashiach.